crucifixion. We believe that he conquered death. We believe in the resurrection, and he's coming back again. We believe.
Well, welcome to another edition of The Mind of Christ. We're glad to have you again. We have been making our way through the words of Jesus and the actions of Jesus, everything he's done. We're trying to determine how he thinks. What is his mind? How do we ascertain the thought processes of Jesus so that we can imitate him even in that level of our lives? It's a very challenging event. That's why we call it Challenger Deep. The deepest part of the ocean, the mind of Christ, is very deep. And we have been plunging into it over the last several months and years for me. Started this journey back in 2010. And what you're getting is some very raw material of the study that I did. It's a very in-depth study. And it is not for the faint of heart, because we are going deeply into God, the Scripture, and deeply into the mind of Christ. So I hope you will, if you want to go back and get context, we have many videos that are archived. You can go back and, and view those. We're in the midst of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're still in Matthew chapter 5. The section that we're starting today, a new section that we're starting today, is Matthew chapter 5, 21 through 48. There's also some additional information that's found in Luke 6, 27 through 30 and verses 32 through 36. Jesus is talking here about 6 different areas of our lives. He talks first about murder and anger. He then talks about lust and adultery, and then he's going to talk about divorce. He's going to talk about oaths, and then retaliation, and then loving our enemies. So obviously this is a very long section, and we're going to tackle the first part today. And so I want to read to you from Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 21. We'll go down to about verse 26 and see if we can cover that part today. Jesus says, "You have heard that the ancients were told," and by the way, I'm reading in the New American Standard Bible, "You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever shall say, You fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. If therefore you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, in order that your opponent may not deliver you to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into the prison. Truly I say to you, you shall not come out of there until you have paid the last cent." Well, let's dive into this. He begins by talking about, you have heard that the ancients were told. The ancients, the original, has the sense of something that is original or primeval. It is those of old time. It's used 3 times in this context. In Luke chapter 9 and verse 8, we have the sense of the prophets of old. In 9:19, Acts 15:17 talks about the early days. Acts 15:21 talks about Moses from ancient generations. 2 Corinthians 5:17 talks about the old. That's the same word, the ancients, has passed away. 2 Peter 2 and verse 5 says that God did not spare the ancient world. This, of course, was the time of Noah. And then in Revelation 12 and verse 9, the serpent of old, or the ancient serpent he is called, because he's been around for a very, very long time. So he's going back to the origins of the Jewish system. Jesus is indicating a change in the systems. Growing up and studying this, in my memory, we often watched and presented the Jewel Miller film strips to people, and the film strips would present the message of salvation according to three different ages: the patriarchal age, the Mosaic age, and the Christian age. So Jesus is going back at least as far as the law of Moses and the Ten Commandments. And so when he thinks about the ancients, he's going way back from his time to at least 1,500 years. These ancients, or people of the distant past, were told, not just told, they were commanded, you shall not commit murder. And the word here, of course, means to put to death, to kill, to slay, to commit murder. Matthew 23, verse 31 and 35, regarding the Jews and their sons, it says that they murdered the prophets, that the blood was shed upon the earth. And so Jesus is talking to people that he is later going to accuse of murder. In this context, it is the taking of innocent life in order to silence the voices of the prophets. So what are the implications of such a command when we talk about murder? Well, capital punishment, war, abortion, euthanasia, suicide, all of these are questions that enter into this command not to murder. The questions centers in the right of one human to take the life of another. Such was done by God's authority by the ancients in capital punishment and war. Some authority was given by statutes, and others were given by verbal commands of God. Division in the body was occurred over such questions. And what I'm referring now to in the church, we have had many divisions over who can a Christian participate in war. Then we talk about, well, what kinds of wars can they participate in a just war as opposed to one that might be considered unjust. It gets into a lot of very deep questions. We also speak of self-defense. Can we kill someone in self-defense? The murder that Jesus speaks of makes one liable to the court. So this is a murder that makes one liable to the court under the law of Moses. So what would not make one liable? So there might be some taking of life that would not cause one to be liable to the courts. So he's talking about it really in the context of Old Testament law. In the Old Testament, various kinds of the taking of life was legislated. Leviticus 20, human sacrifices were of course absolutely forbidden. Capital punishment is demanded in many situations in Leviticus chapter 20. In Deuteronomy 21, it is interesting, in the case of a man found slain in the open country, and it is not known who did it, the elders of the nearest village have to break the neck of an unworked heifer for expiation. In other words, there has to be some life for life. And since we don't know who actually killed this man in the open field, then a heifer is the one who has to suffer for the death. It's just interesting how the law is laid out this way. In Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 and following, there is capital punishment for the rebellious son even, and it's described there as a son who is a glutton and a drunkard. So even under those circumstances, a son could be put to death. In 22 verse 8, Deuteronomy, it is required to make a parapet around the roof of your house so that someone will not fall and die. And so it's like putting a cage around your pool or a fence around your pool. You have to do certain things to ensure that someone can't get hurt. But if you fail to do so, it would bring blood guilt upon you, he says. And then in Deuteronomy 24, verse 16, fathers cannot be put to death for the son, in other words, the sins of the son. This is also reiterated in Ezekiel chapter 18. In Exodus 21, there are various situations covered where loss of life is present. The distinction is made between premeditated, as in lying in wait for someone, or presumptuous murder, and those murders that are more murders of impulse. We might even call them murders of passion. The former is to be put to death. So if you premeditate, you have a premeditated murder, you're there to be put to death. But the latter, those who kill someone on an impulse, may flee for refuge and be put on trial. There was different requirements. If a man struck his slave and the slave died, the slave is considered under Old Testament law to be property. If a woman with child is accidentally struck and miscarries, there can be a fine. An ox who gores someone must be put to death. If the ox was predisposed to goring and the owner did not restrain him, then he too was to be put to death. So the owner could be put to death for something that the ox did if he had not restrained him. It's different if a slave were gored. Now, if a slave was gored, then it was okay. Well, I guess it wasn't okay, but the owner did not have to be put to death. In Leviticus 24:17 and following, the law of life for life was established, or an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth. The strange thing to me about Old Testament laws regarding loss of life is the distinction made between slaves and free men. That is probably the most disturbing part of what I find under the statutes in the Old Testament, although all of them have their distinct difficulties. The approved method of capital punishment in the Old Testament was predominantly by stoning, in which the community participated in that. It was a brutal way to die, perhaps designated to instill in all the community the horror of the crime that had been committed. Now, the word court here, it says that, that a person is liable to the court. It's the word krisis, Krisis. It is a place of decision. By extension, it is a tribunal, implying justice. It can be translated accusation, condemnation, judgment. The word liable here, where it says you're liable to the court, is a word that means held in or by, subjected to. So when you're liable, you're being held by something. You're being subjected to something. You're culpable. Hebrews 2:15, it says that through fear of death, people were subject to slavery all of their lives. In other words, because of their fear of death, they were liable to slavery. This idea is something that is obnoxious. When you have this fear of death and you're subject to slavery all your lives, is something that is obnoxious to you. It's very unpleasant. It's subject to censor. Noxa means harm or danger, like noxious fumes or noxious odors. that you might smell. In Matthew 26, verse 66, when the crowd said he, Jesus, is deserving of death, he is, the word here, deserving, means that is the word noxious. It's used in Mark 3 and verse 29 regarding blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. One is guilty of or in danger of an eternal sin. In 1 Corinthians 11:27, the one eating the bread and drinking the cup in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of, this is the word noxious, of the body and the blood of the Lord. So for that person, the body and the blood of the Lord becomes like a noxious odor, or maybe it is to God. In James 2 and verse 10, the person who breaks the law in one point is guilty or noxious of all, in danger, liable. So Jesus' point is that taking another's life puts one in danger, in this case, judgment of the court. So if you kill someone, murder someone, you're putting your own life in danger, and that will be determined by the court. As Jesus transitions to the idea of, but I say to you, we are at a critical question here of how he uses that phrase. Is he giving by authority a new or additional teaching, or is he merely giving a divine interpretation of the true intent of the law regarding murder? So you need to understand the difference here. When Jesus says, but I say unto you, is he merely interpreting correctly the Old Testament law, or is he giving something new, something that has never been said before? It wasn't said under the Old Testament here. So in other words, is Jesus going back to the original intent for people to avoid anger toward their brother, and that this was assumed in the command not to murder? In other words, is he saying anger is assumed in the command not to murder? And so is he just reinterpreting that? Excuse me. So in that case, anger would have been self-evident that it leads or can lead to murder, and therefore it should be in order to avoid murder, one must avoid becoming angry. Remember, the law reveals the character of God, and so would his law not reflect his whole character instead of some outward manifestation of it? My point is that even under the old law, we're not just dealing here with behaviors, we're dealing with character issues behind the behaviors, because the law of God is based upon the character of God, and therefore his character will be seen in it. But this raises the issue about God's anger, about God becoming angry. So yet for me, a difficult question arises. Did God's anger lead him to take the life of someone or someones? Well, of course it did. The wilderness examples suffice of God becoming angry with the people in the wilderness and many of them dying. So it is inherently wrong. So is it inherently wrong to be angry, leading to someone's death? If it is inherently wrong, then God is also liable, subject to the court, that God is violating his own law. Was God's anger different? And certainly his anger is different in some respects from my anger, but anger is still anger. Or does it have something to do with our fallibility? Is Jesus saying these things about our anger because we are fallible people and that we cannot be trusted in controlling our anger? However, God always righteously controls his anger and any outcome of that anger is going to be justified, where it would not be justified if we were acting on our anger. Well, the word for become angry is the word which means to provoke to anger, to irritate, to be angry, to be indignant, to be enraged. It is based on the word orge, as in the word orgasm, or the sap that is rising in the tree and it is being expressed through the skin of that tree. In the former, there is stimulation as an orgasm. In the latter, there is heat as in the change of the seasons. That's what makes the sap run, which causes sap in the inner part of the tree to kind of ooze out of the trunk, like in maple syrup and in turpentine. These are natural processes. So why does anger have a negative connotation here? The consequences getting ramped up from court, because that's where you first begin, and then going to the Supreme Court, and then to hell itself. In Matthew 18:34, the Lord or the King was moved with anger at the injustice of the forgiven man in not showing forgiveness to his brother. In this case, the king hands him over to the torturers till he pays all that he owes. So there seems to always be some consequence for an injustice that arouses the anger of someone in authority. Here is a point to ponder. Anger creates liability. What is the outcome of anger? There is a consequence or result, and at some point, the result will follow naturally and uncontrollably. So what we're getting at here is that anger automatically causes someone to be liable. And what they do with that anger at that point, if it's not controlled, then at some point that anger will flow naturally and uncontrollably and cause harm. Just as a man with a woman in orgasm, at some point, once they go down that road too far, there will be orgasm. Interesting, Jesus goes into the subject next in the treatment of adultery. If this is in marriage and commitment then the consequences or results will be good. But if outside of marriage, the results may carry extreme liabilities. Anger within certain contexts may be appropriate and lead to just results. But the kind Jesus talks of here gains momentum and takes on a life of its own, leading to ever-increasing liabilities. The court, I'm in trouble. The Supreme Court, I'm in more trouble. Exhausting my possibilities for redemption. And then there's hell. There is no opportunity for redemption here. The punishment is set, no parole. We must explore the progression from anger to raka, to fool, to get Jesus' meaning. So Jesus not only talks about the increased consequences from court to Supreme Court to hell, but he talks about the ramping up of the anger from anger to raka to fool, saying those things, and these things will inform us about what Jesus is saying here, how he's thinking about this. So the progression from anger to raka to fool. Now raka is of Chaldean origin, meaning "O empty one." So it basically means the worthless one, a term of utter vilification. So what is the issue here? To proclaim someone worthless is a designation regarding the person, not a judgment regarding the behavior of the person. Is the point that we have no authority to proclaim one of God's servants or children to be worthless, no longer of value or worth? How do we know when someone is empty? In Luke chapter 13, 6 through 9, Jesus tells the story of the fig tree that did not produce fruit. He proclaimed it worthless, just using up the ground. But the servant begged for one more year to work with it to see if he could get it to bear fruit. Well, this is an example here where Jesus proclaimed the fig tree to be worthless. And he's basically saying raka to the fig tree. In Matthew 25:14 and following, we have the parable of the talents. The last slave who buried his talent was called wicked and lazy and worthless. Another word here. He was without, it was a different word from raka. It's without usefulness. It means unprofitable. But what determines this? How do we determine whether someone is truly worthless? The liability is to the council. The court, as it's translated in the New American Standard Bible, sitting together. It means people who are sitting together, the assembly, probably the Sanhedrin. Matthew 10:17, beware of men because they will deliver you to the court. I'm not sure if I understand the connection between saying raka and the liability of the Sanhedrin. I suppose it depends on who you say it to. So if you say it to a high priest or you say it to someone in authority, you may get hauled into the court of the Sanhedrin. Well, the third progression is saying you fool. So we've gone from anger to raka now to you fool, which is moros, is the word from which we get moron. It means dull or stupid or heedless, or it means a blockhead. It means absurd. It's a fool. It's later used in chapter 7 and verse 26, where Jesus speaks of the fool being the one who hears the word of God and does not put it into practice. And at least 3 times in Matthew 23, Jesus calls the Jewish leaders fools. The virgins of Matthew 25, 5 of them are called fools. And in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 18, one must become foolish in order to become wise. So it can be used in a paradoxical way too. In 1 Corinthians 4 verse 10, Paul was a fool for Christ's sake, and he's probably making reference here to being called a fool by some, but he was happy to accept that if he was a fool for Christ. The liability of this, of saying to someone that they're a fool, is the fiery hell, as is translated. This is Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few moments. The reality of hell is self-evident. The nature of hell may not be so clear. In other words, Jesus talked about hell and made it clear that there is a hell. Well, the nature of that hell is often debated. From this text, Jesus moves from temporal liabilities to an eternal liability. But Jesus uses a temporal term to describe the eternal one, the Gehenna of fire, he says. Remember, he begins this discussion about the command not to murder, and then he shifts to anger, and then to the liabilities of anger, which progresses if not put into check. Gehenna, this is the valley of Jerusalem where the worship of Moloch was carried out. We find that in 1 Kings 11:7, 2 Kings 16:3, and Jeremiah 7:31, and Jeremiah 32:35. This was a place of refuge, trash, carcasses of animals, even human remains of criminals unburied, constant fires which consume the garbage. Also called Tophet in Jeremiah 7 and verse 31. It is an abomination, a place to be spit upon. The word Tophet comes from the word tup, which means to spit, a place of burning or cremation. This became associated with punishment in the other world and of demons and the souls of wicked men. So in 2 Peter 2 and verse 4, Peter uses the word Tartarus, Tarturos, where the sinful angels were cast, but translated here hell. It was told that hell was a Welsh word. I was told that the word hell was a Welsh word used to describe the process of covering the potatoes. And so they would say the words helling the potatoes because that's what helling meant in Welsh, was to cover. And so that's associated with the meaning of the word hell. So Tartarus is the deepest abyss of Hades. In Greek myth, the place of imprisonment and torture, the casting down into it. And so it always has the sense of being down somewhere. Could this be why we think of dungeons, places of torture being deep under castles, etc.? Well, other equivalents of the lake of fire in Revelation 20. When we talk about the fiery hell, other equivalents are the lake of fire mentioned in Revelation 20, 14 and 15. Here, death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire, which is the second death. And the only avoidance of expressing the second death is to have one's name written in the Lamb's Book of Life. So how does an angry person fit into this picture? Well, in Revelation 21 verse 8, it says murderers will have their part in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. So it kind of takes us back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. The overcomer will avoid the lake of fire, Revelation 21 and verse 7. Now there are parallels in 1 John. If you read 1 John 3 and 1 John 5, one dealing with the love of a brother, unlike Cain, who slew his brother. You see where anger can lead? He became angry with his brother and eventually led to murder. In 1 John 3:15, the one who hates his brother is a murderer. Here it doesn't talk about anger, it talks about hate. And he says no murderer has eternal life in him. 1 John 5, the theme is overcoming, is being developed here. And it says, by faith we overcome the world. The one born of God overcomes the world. So the idea of overcoming a particular impulse, in this case anger, which can lead to murder, is to be pursued. In Matthew 25:41, we have everlasting fire, which is talked about, which was prepared for the devil and his angels. Those sent there are called accursed ones. It means to doom. It is the opposite of bless. It is someone who is devoted to destruction, which is the word anathema, an accursed thing. Matthew 11:21, cities who would not listen to Jesus were more cursed than even Sodom and Gomorrah. Anathema means to ban. It means to be excommunicated. From Hebrew, the Hebrew word is harim, anything that was irrevocable, even to the point of death, because death was seen as being irrevocable. If you sinned to a certain extent, then there was no way back from it. You can see this in Leviticus 27:28, Joshua 6:17, Joshua 7:1. Anything that is abominable and detestable, Deuteronomy 7:26. So when we get into these areas, we begin to see that there are places that anger can take us that are very dark places. And so Jesus is saying, let's don't just talk about murder, let's talk about anger, because anger can take us into many places. So in Matthew 25:41, the reference is to those who did not serve the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner, and therefore they could be subject to this ultimate punishment. And Jude 7 speaks of Sodom and Gomorrah indulging in gross immorality, going after strange flesh, were an example of those who would undergo everlasting punishment of fire. Jesus most often uses hell. He's the one who talks about it more than anybody else. Examples: Matthew 5:29 and 30, Matthew 10:28, Luke 12:5, and his half-brother James in James 3 and verse 6 talks about it being punished with fire. In Matthew 5:22, 18:9, in Mark 9:47, these are all examples. The word asbestos, unquenchable, because it talks about unquenchable fire, is added in Mark 9:43 and 45. And then another phrase, huion, Huion, Gehenna, means son of hell in Matthew 23 and verse 15. And then another phrase, crisis, Krisis, Gehenna, which is the punishment of hell, and Matthew 23, 33, and then in Jude 6 and verse and also in verse 13, it includes the blackest darkness, which is kind of interesting that you could have fire and at the same time have blackest darkness. It is clear that this is not a place that anyone would want to be, whether it's a place you consciously will endure forever, or a place of destruction over a certain period of time. And those are the debates between the two. Is hell eternal in the sense that you will suffer consciously forever, or is it a place of destroying the soul or the spirit of man? Well, Jesus will next tell us how to avoid the escalation of anger. Anger mitigation is proactive. In this place, Jesus places the responsibility on the person who is not angry, the one whom the anger is directed. So, you get the point here is he's going to talk about how do you mitigate the anger. So if you know someone is angry with you, how do you try to dispel the anger in the other person? And it's interesting that Jesus holds the object of the anger somewhat responsible for reducing the anger. In Matthew 18 and other places, the responsibility is on the angry person. But here he puts the responsibility on the person to whom the anger is being directed. So Jesus' instructions are reconciliation and friendship. He frames the first in the context of presenting your offering to God. Our offering to God is affected by our personal relationships. So what is this in a Jewish context, and how do we apply it in a Christian context? Well, the word presenting here, prospherio, P-R-O-S-P-H-E-R-O, means to bear forward. In other words, to lead, to tender, or to treat, to bring, to offer, to present unto. The word pros means forward. It's a preposition of direction, means toward. The second word in that phrase, phero, Phero, means to bear or to carry. So it means to carry something toward, in this case, towards God. And the word offering here is the word for sacrifice or gift. In Matthew 8 and verse 4, the cleansed lepers were to present themselves to the priest and to present an offering as commanded by Moses, a testimony to the fact of their healing. In Matthew 23 verse 18, Jesus refers to the offering on the altar. And then in Hebrews 5 and verse 1, the priests are offering gifts and sacrifices for sins. You can see that also in Hebrews 8 verse 3 and verse 4. And then in Hebrews 9 and verse 9, the Old Testament gifts could not make the worshipers perfect. Hebrews 11:4 of Abel, who offered a better sacrifice than Cain. This has elements of Jesus' case. Not sure where the anger originated with Cain towards Abel, but he was offering a gift to God. And so you might find a parallel with Cain and Abel, because you have anger and then you also have the offering of gifts in that story. Jesus adds at the altar. So if you're offering your gift at the altar to indicate a religious activity, it involves a priest and it has some official components. As there are many types of offerings enjoined in the law of Moses, and since Jesus is not specific, the conclusion may be one of our being involved in some type of worship by which we are extending to God a gift that we hope that He will accept as a show of our good relationship with Him. The word for altar here is found in the story of Zacharias in the holy place, where it mentions to the right of the altar of incense. The other altar was the altar for burnt offerings, and so there's a couple of different altars in the holy place. In Matthew 23:35, reference is made to Zechariah, who was murdered between the temple and the altar. In 2 Chronicles 24:20 through 22 gives this story. Zechariah was the son of the priest who confronted the people with their sins. Because you have forsaken the Lord, He has forsaken you. The king Joash joined a conspiracy to have him killed, which they did by stoning him in the court of the house of the Lord. It's a little bit confusing here because Zechariah's father is Jehoiada. In Matthew 23, Zechariah is described here as the son of Berechiah. Zechariah, the prophet in Zechariah 1:1 is the son of Berechiah, who lived after the exile. So it's a little confusing as to who all is being talked about here. So take also to an account that 2 Chronicles was the last book of the Hebrew Bible. Jesus' point was that from Genesis to 2 Chronicles, all the blood of the prophets would come upon his generation. Also note Luke 11:51. And of course, Cain and Abel were involved in altar as well. So in Luke 11:51, no mention of Zechariah's father is made. It makes me wonder if some scribes added Berechiah to Matthew's text, thinking he was helping Jesus out. Anyway, the altar of burnt offerings was located in the courtyard. See Leviticus 27 verses 1 and following for a description of the bronze altar in the courtyard. So it wasn't actually in the most holy place. The word brother does not always mean in this text here. So he says if you know your brother has something against you. He says, and so the word brother does not always mean a spiritual relationship between two saved males. Brother is contextual. It means it can be blood brothers or adoptive. It can be in regard to nationality or race or due to being in the same organization. So in Acts 22, verse 13, Ananias refers to Saul as a brother. He was a Jewish brother, but he was not yet saved. The word is adelphos. Delphos is wombed, one connected with another in any kind of intimacy or fellowship. By implication, one loved as a brother, as is somewhat like neighbor in the story of the Good Samaritan, who is my neighbor. One point is that the person is someone that you value, and the relationship is one that you value. It's important to God how you treat the relationships. So as we try to get into a real life understanding of what Jesus is saying, there seems to be some, number one, conscience involved. There is some inconvenience involved. So in our consciences, we are not okay with someone not being okay with us. Let me say that again. In our conscience, we are not okay with someone not being okay with us. I find this difficult to apply as to the quality and quantity and logistics. To what extent does someone have to be upset with me before I confront them? When should I merely overlook an offense? Remember, in this context, Jesus is speaking of the escalation of anger. Whatever it is the other person has against me is serious enough to cause them anger towards me, and this needs to be checked. But the passage, Jesus assumes I can do this logistically. He assumes that it's possible. That is, I know where the person is, that they are near enough to accomplish this, and that the person is willing to listen and possibly reconcile. But perhaps there is something else here in the context. That is, that the offense has the potential of getting me thrown in jail, and that the one who is angry has already initiated action against me. Could Jesus just be telling us to settle out of court? Later in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul teaches this. Have people in the church settle the dispute to keep it from going before the pagans, working out agreements with others to avoid criminal proceedings and possible prosecution, which may not always be just? Is this what is being discussed here? Reconciliation is the heart of God. He wants people to agree, to get along, to walk together, to work it out, to demonstrate love for one another. Romans 12:18, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with one another. So is this inconvenient? Yes, it requires us to make the effort if we are in the wrong or if we are in the right. Peace and reconciliation is always my responsibility. This is not just about working out a deal, but working out a relationship. So he says, be reconciled, to change thoroughly. It can be a mental reconciliation of where you're okay within your mind. It means to change one's feelings towards another. And the word is only used here in Matthew 5:24. In Galatians 4:20, Paul hopes to be able to change his tone, one of being perplexed, or in 1 Corinthians 15:51 and 52, the changing to take place at the resurrection. So there's some change that has to occur. Or the earth which will be rolled up and changed, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 12. By the way, Jesus speaks of this. There must be choice that we can make towards others with whom we have friction. So we have the choice to be reconciled and the possibility of being reconciled. Then Jesus takes this change of mind and feeling to another level. He says, make friends quickly. make friends, to be well-minded, to reconcile, to agree. There's two words involved here. The first word means benevolent or kindly, and the other is the word mind. And so those two words means to be okay in our minds, to be well disposed or well intentioned towards another. This is not the common word for friend, phileo. Jesus describes the other person as an opponent, someone who is in a lawsuit. Even Satan is described as an opponent, the plaintiff or the accuser. Luke chapter 12, verse 58 parallels this. An adversary or enemy in Luke 18, verse 3. The widow pleads with a judge for legal protection from her opponent. 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 uses it of Satan to mean as a means for right or justice. Jesus seems to indicate here that even someone who is in the right may still be denied justice in court, and it would be better to settle outside of court. Jesus knew this firsthand. He was constantly being refused justice, being accused falsely, and would undergo a travesty of justice at the hands of the Jews and the Romans. In his case, there was no settlement or the way to court, on the way to court. God used this very injustice of the cross to justify all the unjust. God can commandeer evil and make it accomplish his will. So was Jesus' intent merely to avoid jail and full payment? In other words, was Jesus about not accepting full responsibility for one's actions? Of course not. I think the point is that reconciliation involves grace, not condemnation. In our relationship with God, we cannot pay the last cent. We need grace. We don't need justice. Jailed until we pay the last cent is hell. We never reach the last cent. Anger often leads to wanting our day in court so we can feel justified. We're often looking for a way to alleviate our shame or embarrassment. Though we may have some guilt and liability, we seek ways to mitigate it, at least so that we can save face. The issue becomes about me. How do I look? What will people think? The accuser seems to have power over us. And if we respond in anger or self-justification and retaliation, we escalate the matter and we put ourselves in more jeopardy. But the path of reconciliation and making friends is better and often helps us accomplish our desired end. A fight often just leaves everyone bloody, no winners. Truth, justice, honor, mercy, all of these get trampled in the process. The parable in Matthew chapter 18, 21 and following concerning forgiveness, up to 70 times 7, talks about this. The forgiven person who does not forgive those who owe them will be held accountable to the judge and the torturers until he should repay all that he owed him. Think of this impossible situation. How can anyone repay such a huge debt? And how can they do so in jail while they're being tortured? There is no opportunity to earn a living or repay even a portion of it. So anger often displaces mercy and merely creates a world of opponents. We do well to handle our anger before it handles us. And we would also do well to help other people who are angry against us to handle their anger before we may suffer because of it. Well, as you can see, this is very in-depth and there's lots to this. And so we've covered the first aspect of this section about anger and the consequences of anger and how it relates to murder. And the next time we'll go into the next section, what has to do with lust and adultery. It's a very similar process that we'll follow in trying to understand the mind of Christ regarding those things. Well, thank you for joining us. And I hope you get something from this that you can use in your life in order to have the mind of Christ. Until next time, God bless.